My name is Margaret Callahan. I'm 58 years old, and for the last 11 years, I've watched people mistake me for a woman with nothing. I've built a hospitality company that now operates 41 boutique hotels across 9 states. I was disowned at 27, and I built a $340 million company without a single dollar of my family's money. 6 weeks ago, at my grandson's christening, my daughter-in-law introduced me to a room of 80 guests as just the babysitter. She had no idea that within 4 minutes, a Catholic priest would say my name out loud, and the entire room would go quiet. This is Oliver's babysitter, Margaret. She helps out a lot, Vanessa told the Monsignor, smiling the way people smile when they've already decided you don't matter. If you're watching this, go ahead and hit like, subscribe if you're new here, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I read every one of them. But to understand why that moment in that church mattered so much, let me take you back to March of 1995 to a kitchen in Millbrook, Ohio, where I said one word that cost me my entire family. I was 27. My parents, Walter and Eleanor Hayes, owned Hayes Hardware on Route 9, a store my grandfather opened in 1958, the kind of place that smelled permanently of sawdust, fertilizer, and the coffee my father kept burning on a hot plate by the register. My older brother Richard was the golden child, quarterback in high school, the one whose report cards got taped to the refrigerator, the one my mother introduced first at every gathering, always with his job title attached, even after he'd been let go from 2 of them. I was the daughter who read too much and asked too many questions, the one my parents described to strangers, when they described me at all, as still figuring things out. That March, the store was $180,000 in debt from a renovation Richard had championed, and my father had approved without a second opinion, and my parents asked me to co-sign a second loan against a small inheritance from my grandmother, the same $34,000 I just used as the down payment on a 4-room bed and breakfast in Kennebunkport, Maine. I said no, not because I didn't love them, because I had finally built something that was mine, and I wasn't going to mortgage it to save a business my father had run into the ground twice before, in 1988 and again in 1993. My father stood up from that kitchen table, so fast his chair hit the linoleum, and skidded into the cabinet behind him. "You were never really one of us, were you?" he said, his voice flat, like he'd rehearsed it. My mother didn't defend me. She just refolded a dish towel that was already folded, smoothing it against the counter like the conversation was already over and beneath her attention. Richard, sitting across from me with his arms crossed, said nothing at all, which somehow stung more than if he had. 3 days later, a letter came from a family attorney in Dayton removing me from the will and revoking my authority as my mother's medical proxy. I didn't cry in that kitchen, and I didn't cry reading that letter either. I remember feeling strangely still, almost weightless, like I'd been braced for this my whole life without ever admitting it to myself. I packed my car, a 1989 Ford Tempo with 94,000 miles on it, 1 working headlight, and a cassette deck that 8 tapes, and I drove 11 hours to Maine with $6,200 to my name, and a folder of documents I didn't yet know I'd keep for the next 31 years. That's where I met Ruth Alderman. Ruth was 63, widowed twice, ran a failing 6-room inn called the Widow's Walk on a bluff above a rocky stretch of coastline, and she hired me as her only employee for $9 an hour, because in her words, standing in her doorway in a paint-stained apron, you've got the look of somebody who doesn't quit. Ruth became the family I chose in every way that mattered. She taught me bookkeeping at her kitchen table at midnight, a pot of chamomile tea between us, marking up my ledgers in red pen with more patience than either of my parents had ever shown me. She co-signed my first small business loan, $22,000 from a credit union in Biddeford, when no bank would touch a 27-year-old with no credit history and a last name nobody would vouch for. She never once asked me to prove I deserved her kindness, which was, I'd come to understand, the entire difference between her and the people I'd left behind. I started a binder that first winter, a plain green 3-ring binder where I kept every financial statement, every rejected loan application, every scrap of correspondence, good or bad. It wasn't about proof. It was about not disappearing, about having something solid to hold onto on the nights I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. Year 1, being broke even for the first time in its history. Year 3. We bought the property next door and expanded to 11 rooms. Year 6. I met David Callahan, a marine contractor with kind eyes, sawdust permanently under his fingernails, and no interest whatsoever in my last name's history, and we married in Ruth's garden with 11 guests and a cake David's sister baked herself. Year 9. Our son Daniel was born 7 pounds 2 ounces on a Tuesday in October. Year 12. Ruth passed away in her sleep and left me the widow's walk outright, along with a note that just said, "Don't you dare shrink now." By then I'd already opened 2 more properties under a name I invented on a napkin one night, Harborstone Hospitality Group. In 18 years, I turned 4 coastal inns into a company with 41 locations across 9 states and a valuation, as of last quarter's audit, of $340 million. I became CEO of a company with 1,900 employees, and I kept the green binder in a fireproof filing cabinet in my office the entire time, because some habits are less about the past than about never letting yourself be caught unprepared again. Contact from my family, over 22 years, came exactly twice. Once, a birthday card I sent to my mother in 2003 came back stamped, returned to sender, not at this address. Once in 2011, Richard texted me 11 words, "Dad's in the hospital." Doesn't mean anything changes. Nothing did. My father died in October 2016. I found out from an obituary a cousin forwarded me 3 days after the funeral had already happened, as though even my grief had been scheduled around. I didn't go. I sent flowers to the funeral home instead, $85 worth, because some part of me still believed in doing the decent thing, even when decency had never once been returned to me. David passed in 2019, aneurysm, no warning, and Daniel and I got closer than we'd ever been, 2 people learning to grieve the same man differently. 3 years ago, Daniel married Vanessa Pruitt, a marketing director from a family in Cedar Falls that measured everything. Houses, vacations, which private school your child would attend before that child could even sit up, the way other families measured love. I never corrected Vanessa's assumptions about me. I still drove a 2011 Honda CR-V with 140,000 miles on it. I still wore clothes from the same 3 stores I'd shopped at for 15 years. After what my own money had cost me with my family of origin, I'd made a quiet decision. I would never again let anyone value me by a number. I would let my grandson know me as a person first. Vanessa filled in the blanks herself, and the blank she landed on was harmless, broke, useful. When Oliver was born 14 months ago, I started watching him 2 days a week so Vanessa could keep her job. I never once heard a thank you that didn't come with a request attached. 2 weeks before the christening, I was in Daniel and Vanessa's kitchen in Cedar Falls, waiting for Oliver to wake from a nap, when Vanessa's phone lit up on the counter. I wasn't trying to look, but the message was already on the screen, part of a thread with her mother and sister titled Vanessa Fam. Her mother had written, "Honestly, she's basically a built-in nanny at this point. Saves you what? 30 grand a year in daycare? Don't rock the boat with her." Vanessa had replied with a laughing emoji and exactly. Just gotta keep her feeling useful, LOL. I set the phone down exactly where it had been. I didn't say a word. I just went home and called my attorney the next morning. Robert Chezik has handled my legal affairs for 19 years. I told him I wanted to set up an irrevocable trust for Oliver, $250,000 for his education, structured so that no one could touch the principal, ever, for any reason, except Oliver's own schooling, with me named as the sole trustee until he turned 25. Robert asked me if this was about protecting Oliver or protecting myself. I told him it was about making sure love was never confused with leverage again. I had the paperwork finalized 9 days later, printed, and sealed in a cream envelope I planned to give Daniel and Vanessa at the christening. The christening was at St. Augustine's, the church where David and I had been married in Ruth's Garden's absence, 23 years earlier by a different priest. 80 guests filled the reception hall afterward, white tablecloths, a 3-tier cake. Vanessa's parents holding court near the gift table in clothes that cost more than my first month's rent in Maine. I wore a navy dress I'd owned since 2018. Monsignor Patrick Ferris approached our group to greet the family, and Vanessa, mid-laugh with her mother, gestured toward me without missing a beat. This is Oliver's babysitter, Margaret. She helps out a lot. I felt Daniel go rigid beside me. I didn't. I've had 22 years of practice staying steady when a room decides who I am for me. Monsignor Ferris paused, studying my face for a long second, the way people do when a name is tugging at something they can't quite place. Margaret Callahan? Harborstone Hospitality. I nodded. His eyebrows lifted, and he set down the small blue prayer book he'd been carrying. You're the Margaret Callahan who funded the entire renovation of St. Bridget's shelter in Portland. I sat on the diocesan board that approved the grant. $2.1 million, wasn't it, back in 2022? The reception hall, or at least the 10 feet around us, went quiet the way a room goes quiet when it recalibrates in real time. Conversations trailing off mid-sentence as heads turned. Vanessa's smile stayed frozen on her face a full 3 seconds too long. Her mother's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, hovering there like she'd forgotten what it was for. I'm his grandmother, I said simply, my voice even. I also happen to run a hotel company. Those aren't mutually exclusive. I reached into my purse and set the cream envelope on the gift table, addressed to Daniel and Vanessa. That's Oliver's education trust. $250,000, locked until he needs it for school, with me as trustee. I wanted you both to have it today, regardless of what happened in this conversation. I didn't raise my voice once. I've learned that a document on a table says more than an argument ever could. Vanessa's composure cracked. Just for a moment, I watched real fear pass through her eyes, not embarrassment, fear. I didn't mean it like that, she said quietly, and for 1 second she looked 26 and unsure of herself, not performing for her mother at all. I never knew what to call you. You never told me any of this. That part was true, and I told her so. But her mother stepped in before the moment could breathe, muttering something about people who hide things to test their family, and Vanessa's face closed back up like a door. I didn't survive being erased once to spend my golden years being introduced as the help. I said that once, quietly, to the small circle still listening. And then I asked the caterer where the coffee was, because there is nothing more powerful than simply continuing your day. The consequences that followed weren't mine to deliver. Vanessa's parents, who'd spent the afternoon barely acknowledging me, spent the rest of it unable to stop asking questions. Daniel didn't say much that day, but he showed up at my house 4 nights later, sat at my kitchen table, and apologized for 3 years of never correcting the story Vanessa had written about me in her head. That's a conversation still unfolding between them, not one I'm going to force. Richard reached out 2 months ago, having apparently seen a trade publication profile on Harborstone. He asked how I was doing, then asked within the same text whether I'd consider helping out with the business he was starting. I told him I'd love to have coffee with him. No laptops, no ledgers. He hasn't responded yet. The door's open. I'm not holding my breath, standing in the doorway. If this is hitting close to home, drop a comment, because I promise you're not the only one who's ever been underestimated by the people who should have known better. Here's what I've learned, in my own words, not borrowed from anyone. The people who mistake your quiet for your value have already told you exactly how they see you. Believe them the first time, and build your life somewhere they can't reach it. You don't owe anyone a resume of your worth before they're allowed to treat you with basic respect. I spent 31 years building something no one could take back from me twice. If you've ever been the one written off, the one underestimated, the one called just anything by someone who should have known better, I see you, and I promise you, it is never too late to make them recalculate. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and tell me in the comments, would you have opened that envelope, or would you have let the silence sit a little longer? I'll see you in the next one.